What would happen if a tiny creature could clean the ocean? Simply by existing. No machines, no technology. Yet it filters up to about 53 gallons of water a day, and once helped clean an entire ocean. When it disappeared, the ocean began to die too. All that life existed only because the water was clear enough to see several feet down, and the main reason was oysters. It sounds unbelievable, but a single oyster with no eyes, no brain, no legs can filter 40-50 gallons of water a day. That means just 5 oysters can filter as much water as a full bathtub. So, how much did the billions of oysters in Chesapeake filter back then? Enough to clean the entire bay in just 3-4 days. Even today's modern water treatment plants can't match that speed. Oysters lived in giant reefs, 10 feet tall and stretching for miles, so much so that 18th and 19th century ships had to change course to avoid these reef mountains. Some oyster beds were so large they stuck out above the water at low tide. In 1898, Maryland fishermen harvested 5.3 billion oysters, more than 15 million bushels, a number so huge that oysters were called Chesapeake gold for the massive profits they brought. Oyster shells were burned into lime for building houses, crushed for roads, and in Maryland and Virginia, you can still find old streets paved with crushed oyster shells. Oysters were as cheap as potatoes, sold everywhere in markets as food for the poor. But what happens when humans grow too fast? The ecosystem couldn't keep up, and that's when everything started to spiral out of control. Of course, a rich ecosystem like Chesapeake Bay doesn't die in a day. It's more accurate to say there were many accumulating reasons. First was human pressure. The Chesapeake watershed includes some of America's most densely populated cities: Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Richmond, Arlington. If you look at a U.S. population density map, you'll see a dark red streak from New York down to Chesapeake, one of the most crowded regions in the country. Everything they produce, from soap, grease, fertilizer, detergents, all eventually flows down the Potomac, Susquehanna, James, and straight into Chesapeake Bay. Agriculture contributes 48% of the nitrogen and 27% of the phosphorus. 2022 data. If you've ever seen green algae blooms, you know what that means. The water gets stripped of oxygen. Every big rain, wastewater plants overflow, adding another 11% nitrogen and 15% phosphorus to the bay. 2021. Sewage, fertilizer, organic matter, all mix together and flow into an already exhausted ecosystem. Sound familiar? This is the same pattern that killed Lake Erie in the 1960s, but Chesapeake is even worse because it's much bigger. But the real decline didn't start with pollution. It started at the bay's bottom, again because of humans, with the destruction of the ancient 5,000-year-old oyster reefs. Since 1870, fishermen used iron dredges, heavy metal frames dragged across the bottom to harvest more oysters, which crushed the reef base, destroyed the hard rock oysters need to attach to, and ground it all down. After just 2-3 seasons of dredging, many oyster reefs were wiped out forever. A natural structure that took 5,000 years to form was destroyed in just 10 years. Nowhere else in the world was oyster reef destruction as fast as Chesapeake. Even the Great Barrier Reef took decades to decline, not just a few seasons. Desperation escalated with the oyster wars. Maryland and Virginia fought over harvesting grounds, leading to more than 100 real gunfights on the water. Chesapeake Bay, once so peaceful that dolphins swam up the rivers, became a battleground, leading to the creation of the Oyster Navy, a real navy to stop oyster pirates. Yes, at a time when oyster stocks were critically low and people were fighting over the scraps instead of protecting the reefs. And then came what everyone could predict. When the biological foundation is destroyed, the whole ocean starts to collapse like a row of dominoes. First, eutrophication. When 18 million people dump nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic matter into the rivers, everything oysters used to filter in days now goes unfiltered. There was a time when Chesapeake Bay oysters could filter the entire bay in 3-4 days. But by 1988, that time had stretched to 325 days. That's the ecosystem's way of telling us that over 90% of oysters were gone. Oyster reef area in Maryland dropped from 313 square miles to just 58 square miles by 2008, an 80% loss for the whole bay. With the filters gone, toxic algae exploded out of control. The water turned murky, green as pea soup, with a strong, fishy smell. Sunlight couldn't reach the bottom, killing 90% of the underwater grass meadows that fed the entire food chain. When the grass died, the small fish disappeared. When the small fish disappeared, the big fish left. The food chain went into complete collapse, and in the darkness of thick algae, the dead zone expanded to become a true sea of death. Every year, Chesapeake Bay has 2,300 square miles of severe oxygen depletion larger than the island of Bali, or 3 times the size of Tokyo. Some areas have zero oxygen for 6 months straight. Really, zero oxygen means no fish, no crabs, no marine worms. Not even most bacteria can survive. In 2010 alone, the dead zone killed over 75,000 tons of bottom-dwelling creatures. If you piled them on shore, it would be a mountain of sea corpses taller than a 10-story building. And when the bottom dies, the consequences spread onto land. Ghost forests appear coastal woods standing dead because salty water floods the marshes. In Maryland, some places lost 20–40% of their forests in just a decade. The water became more acidic, so baby oysters, which need to form shells in their first 2–3 days, couldn't make CaCO3 and died en masse. At the same time, a lesser-known threat surged: Vibrio vulnificus, the flesh-eating bacteria. Yes, oysters used to filter them out, but now just a small cut exposed to polluted water can cause infection, with a 33–50% fatality rate. Chesapeake Bay became one of the highest-risk places in the country. In 2010, a Maryland fisherman got a tiny cut while untangling a net just the size of a pinhead. 3 days later, he died from Vibrio. In 2017, a woman in Virginia got infected just from wading in shallow water. Her leg turned dark purple in less than 2 days. All these factors led to the scariest thing: no return zones, parts of the bay bottom that can no longer recover naturally, even if left alone for 100 years. For the first time in U.S. history, scientists recorded a permanently dead sea zone. By the mid-1980s, oyster stocks had crashed from their peak to rock bottom. Not only did the environment tank, but the coastal economy took a huge hit. Over $4 billion in losses over 30 years from the collapse of oyster harvesting, declining tourism, and pollution cleanup costs. But even that number doesn't capture the true loss. Because what's lost most isn't money, it's an ocean that once functioned in perfect balance. But just when everyone thought Chesapeake Bay had reached the point of no return, the largest marine restoration effort in U.S. history began. The permanent Dead Sea alarmed scientists, authorities, and the Bay community, making it clear that if they didn't act, this 5,000-year-old ocean would disappear completely within their children's lifetime. So in 1993, an unlikely alliance formed: oceanographers, environmental groups, government agencies, and hundreds of volunteers. They called this mission the Oyster Resurrection. It sounds strange, but it was the only key to saving the entire bay. Their goal sounded impossible: restore all 20 historic oyster beds by 2025. Bill Goldsboro, director of the Chesapeake Bay Foundation's Oyster Restoration Program, even said bluntly, "We're fighting an enemy that we created ourselves." The Bay Rescue didn't start by releasing fish or pumping oxygen into the water, but with something much more down to earth: collecting oyster shells from restaurants. Every year, the Chesapeake Bay Foundation gathers over 200,000 pounds of oyster shells from hundreds of local restaurants and seafood chains. All the shells are washed, sun-dried for 3–6 months to kill MSX and dermobacteria, then placed in tanks with millions of tiny oyster larvae. Each larva is only as big as a speck of dust. But when it finds the right home, a clean shell it attaches with a super strong natural cement. A shell the size of your hand can host 5,200 baby oysters. And when dropped into the bay, they become living bricks to rebuild the oyster reef system that humans destroyed last century. However, Chesapeake Bay in the 1990s was nothing like the past. The water was 3 times murkier than natural, oxygen levels swung wildly by season, and MSX and dermo could wipe out an entire oyster population in just 2–3 breeding seasons. If you released wild oysters, they'd all die. So scientists at the Horn Point Laboratory began creating a super oyster generation. Oysters that grow 70% faster, are 3 times more resistant to MSX, can handle changing salinity, and survive low oxygen that would kill wild oysters in 24 hours. These became the main army to rebuild the bay bottom. Below the surface, a massive but quiet construction campaign took place. Over 25,000 acres of new oyster reefs were built from recycled shells, crushed limestone, bioceramics, biodegradable bricks, and especially perforated concrete blocks called reef balls. Even before oysters attach, these structures quickly become shelters for fish, crabs, and shrimp, like rebuilding the skeleton of a body coming back to life. Near the shore, living breakwaters were built to cut wave energy by 76%, protecting coastal marshes from erosion caused by climate change. These not only save oysters, but also the mangrove plants, the green lungs of the bay. What makes this resurrection special isn't just the technology, but the community's involvement. Over 20,000 Maryland and Virginia residents hang oyster cages under their docks. Each cage holds dozens to hundreds of baby oysters cared for by locals for 6-12 months before they personally add them to the recovering reefs. For them, it's not just volunteering, it's a way of giving back to the bay that's fed their families for generations. And while thousands work underwater, up above, NASA monitors the whole recovery with Landsat and MODIS satellites. NASA tracks water clarity, nitrogen flow, toxic algae blooms, and the shrinking of the dead zone each season. This is the first marine restoration campaign in U.S. history tracked from space, showing the scale and seriousness of the effort. Some satellite maps show that in areas with new oyster reefs, water clarity improved by 20–40% in just 2 years, and seasonal dead zones shrank noticeably. From 2010 to 2023, Chesapeake Bay finally started showing signs of recovery. In 2010, the Bay Health Index was just 31/100, barely above 28. 100 inches, 2008. But for scientists, just stopping the downward slide was a victory. By 2021, the UMCES Environmental Institute recorded a clear improvement in water clarity compared to 2020, and by 2023, the bay reached a C+ grade, its highest since 2002. A small change, but proof that life is really trying to crawl back from the brink. But looking at the big picture, 40 years have passed and progress is still so slow that many people ask, why is restoring a bay so hard? The reason is scale. Chesapeake is so vast that every job must be planned down to each square yard of bay bottom. Where to place new reefs, where to spread shells, where the currents are right, where the base rock needs rebuilding. Each reef needs tons of shells washed, dried, seeded with larvae, then finally dropped in the right spot. Sounds simple, but in reality, it's months of work, requiring massive manpower and money. In many areas, they even need the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to transport and drop each ton of material in exactly the right place just a few yards off, and the reef could fail if the currents aren't right. And before they could even celebrate small wins, Chesapeake was hit by something no one can control: climate. Hurricane Isabel in 2003 blew away many newly restored reefs, wiping out years of work in just hours. Sea level rises 0.1–0.2 inches a year, increasing erosion and eating away at marshes that naturally hold nutrients and filter water. Warmer water makes dermo disease spread faster, attacking even the super oyster generations. And every time there's a big rain, farm nitrogen is washed straight into the bay. Algae blooms return, and the ecosystem falls back a few steps. But people didn't stop. To speed things up, they built the floating factory, the CBF Mobile Oyster Restoration Center. It's not a modern lab on land, but 2 huge barges joined together, floating right on the James River, carrying 6, 8, 4, 5-gallon tanks to raise oyster larvae right where they'll be released. By avoiding long-distance transport, which kills many larvae, the floating factory doubled output, helping Virginia produce up to 15 million oysters a year. While other places still do it by hand with buckets, tanks, and small shell piles, Chesapeake has one of the most modern and bold models in America. But it's not just CBF. Another huge force in the resurrection is the Oyster Recovery Partnership, ORP, founded in 1994. Since then, they've helped restore 10 billion oysters on over 2,965 acres. Numbers you'd expect from a forest, not a brainless shellfish. Thanks to ORP, Chesapeake has the largest oyster shell recycling network in the U.S., with 200 restaurants, 70 collection sites, and 300,000 bushels of shells recycled each year, enough for 1.3 billion new oysters. Every year, over 2,000 volunteers across 35 river branches join the network. Some drive boats to collect shells, some sift shells, some wash tanks, some transfer larvae, some work all night to get reef seeded before the tide changes. They're not scientists or experts, just regular people who believe that if they don't save Chesapeake Bay today, their children will have nothing left to inherit. Most importantly, right now, the water is clearer. What 2 generations of Bay residents had forgotten is now returning. The surface isn't milky anymore on sunny days. You can see light reaching the bottom. Monitoring stations record water clarity up 15–25%. That might sound small, but it's the difference between life and death for the entire bottom ecosystem. Then the seagrass, once wiped out by 90%, started coming back. In many places you can see swaying eelgrass meadows as if they never left. Ask any marine ecologist and they'll say, seagrass regrowth means the bottom is breathing again. No light, no oxygen, no stable bottom, the grass dies. But now it's back, signaling that the young oyster reefs are holding mud better, filtering water better, and providing shade for the whole area. At the same time, blue crabs, once down over 60%, are recovering in many river branches. Traps now catch more fish and crabs than before. Fishermen who once thought their industry would die before they grew old now have real hope that Chesapeake can truly be home again. While Chesapeake Bay struggles through its tough resurrection, about 250 miles north in New York, another story unfolds. If Chesapeake is America's largest natural bay, New York Harbor is the country's most exploited and neglected waterway. Throughout the 20th century, it received hundreds of millions of gallons of sewage daily. Heavy metals settled on the bottom, oil slicks covered the surface, and nearly all the marine life vanished. Yet in this steel city, one of the world's boldest marine restoration experiments began, planting 1 billion oysters. There was a time when oysters in New York were so plentiful they were sold as cheap street food, a part of the city's culture. But by 1927, the entire oyster population was gone, 100% wiped out. The water was so dirty that if you put oysters back, they'd die in hours. But nearly a century later, a group of teachers, divers, engineers, biologists, and thousands of students decided to do the impossible: bring oysters back to one of America's most polluted waters. The project is called the Billion Oyster Project. But in New York, the oysters aren't grown for eating. The water still isn't clean enough, and eating them is out of the question. They're grown for a single purpose: to clean the harbor. One oyster can filter nearly 50 gallons of water a day. A large reef can act like a giant underwater lung, trapping silt, stopping algae blooms, and giving small fish a home. So the project started by collecting millions of pounds of oyster shells from Manhattan restaurants, washing and drying them, then turning them into living platforms for oyster larvae before returning them to the harbor. From there, every perforated concrete block, every steel cage, every bio-brick was dropped into the harbor as the first foundations for a new underwater city. Photos of divers planting oyster reefs against the Manhattan skyline seem unbelievable, but it's happening every day, right under millions of passing boats. The project has restored over 100 million oysters, mobilized more than 15,000 volunteers, and 11,000 students, making ocean restoration part of education, community, and New York culture. In the end, even though hundreds of millions of oysters have been restored, one undeniable truth remains: Chesapeake Bay can never be completely clean as long as agriculture and industry around the bay keep operating. We can't ask 18 million people to stop eating, stop farming, or stop discharging waste, but we can tighten regulations, reduce nitrogen and phosphorus, manage stormwater with marshes and retention ponds, upgrade water treatment plants, limit fertilizer, and as Virginia has done, even ban some de-icing salts containing N.P. That's the only road, there are no shortcuts. If Chesapeake's resurrection succeeds, this model could be used for New York Harbor, Sydney Harbor, the North Sea, Japan's Inland Sea, and dozens of other seas on the brink of becoming dead zones. But if it fails, Chesapeake will be a prophecy for the future. that oceans around the world could turn into permanent dead zones. So the biggest question remains, can humans save the ocean with the very species we once ate 99% of? What do you think? Leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and let me know which topic you want to explore next.